couple of points I want to review. I didn't quite cover. On the Greeks and the tax farmers, there's an interesting story from a lady from the Isle of Kos, and she says every door now trembles at the tax farmers, indicating the fear of them. And they, two of the Greek islands tried to withdraw from the Athenian League. One was Melos and Melistia. Anyway, Mytilene is called. Anyway, so the Greeks didn't think that was a good idea because they needed the money. And so they descended on these two islands and killed all the men and took the women and children and sold them into slavery. So, it wasn't good to be a tax rebel in those days. And then they had this gang of 5 that would go out and visit the various city-states in the Athenian League, and they would show up with a military escort, and they were a rough bunch. And in one of my books, I have a picture of it's been unearthed, and it's a story about what these guys did. So those were the days when it wasn't good to not pay your taxes. It was kind of a rough time. I did talk a little bit about, just so you guys get the Hanukkah story right, and you want to tell it to your Jewish friends. The Greeks had instituted some heavy, burdensome taxes, 1/3. Now 1/3 was, and this is gross, this is gross production tax. So it's, and it's also assuming that the production was there, because even if the production wasn't there, they still wanted their 1/3. Well, that was a huge tax, because the Greeks were only a 10% desuma, they called that, and the Egyptians was 20%. So this heavy tax that was on the Jews was what set off the rebellion of the Maccabees, and it was a family project carried on for a while. And they revolted over the taxes, and when they won, they made a deal in which they got an immunity from taxes for quite a few years, and the taxes were greatly reduced. It turned out to be a very successful tax revolt, and that, of course, the story centers around the temple and the oil burning in it, but that was what the rebellion was all about. It wasn't about the fact that the girls and boys were running around naked in the gymnasiums. But that was a little bit tough with the pious Jews. But that was really the essence of it, and I do have it in the book, and you would probably enjoy it. The other point that I think is about rebellions. Rebellions over the long run have not been all that successful. I think, Americans are kind of spoiled because of the American Revolution. But then you people here in the South, you try to rebel and it didn't work very good. It was a terrible, terrible thing. Almost unbelievable that American people could do that. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but when you consider they killed 250,000 in the South, that was as much slaughter as the Russians and the Germans slaughtered each other in World War II in proportion to population. And then in the North, they got 350,000 Yankees were killed. Boy, that was a lot of people in those days. And what were they fighting for? To preserve the Union? I mean, to deny them the right of self-determination, the right to establish their own form of government and stuff. It goes against the very grain of everything America stood for. I think it's hard to believe that we had people so stupid, and so reckless and so brutal. When I submitted this manuscript to be published on the Civil War, I had obligation to submit it to the publisher in New York, who had published my previous book, and they wrote back and they said, well, a lot of what you say is true, but the gatekeepers of the Civil War won't give you a fair hearing. So we don't want to publish your book because it just ain't going to sell. So that was a jolt in a sense, but it was a good thing because they did a lousy job. The book here, The Dirty Rotten Taxes, was a big disappointment because it was so lousy in terms of the printing and the quality of it. I did this because a few people had contacted me about the bigger book and said, well, why don't you just make a small volume on the United States and American history? And then some guy can pick it up in the airport and he's flying to for a business trip to the place. He can read it during the day and he'll enjoy it. So I thought that was a good idea. So I went ahead and they thought it was a good idea and they went ahead and published it. But then they published a very poor quality book, in my opinion, and they tried to charge $25 for it. Well, that wasn't the idea. The idea is a book that would cost $10. That was the reason I printed it. And of course, it sold okay, but it didn't make them a barrel of money. So they pulp them if they don't sell them. I think they made a couple of printings. It was a little bit disappointing. The only thing that was disappointing was that the Civil War book won a National Book Award, and now they're going into a hardback edition or softback edition, and it's selling very, very well. I had a chance to write a letter and rub their nose in it. Yeah.
Not having read the Human Events book, was there any attempt in the 1840s and 50s to try to come to a compromise, rather than kill each other? Is there a way? Were they North too stubborn, or they just would not give up their power?
Well,
was there any attempts to?
We'll go back to the history of the tariff. The first tariff was called the Tariff of Abomination, and that was in 1828. And South Carolina had passed the resolution, with canceling the tax on this tariff. And Andrew Jackson got all huffy, and he was going to go to war, and so finally, I think it was Calhoun or Clay got together, and they kind of made a compromise, and they agreed to reduce the tariff. So the tariff was reduced a bit. It was reduced, and the South tolerated it, but it still wasn't fair. You see, the South point was that the Constitution said that taxes had to be uniform throughout the United States, and uniform meant the same for everybody, and why should the Southerners pay all the damn taxes? Was their argument, and they were right in that, you see. And the Northern, on the other hand, they thought it was just politics, who's got the votes and so forth, and then they had a bit of a recession in 1857, and they blamed it onto the South, and they blamed it onto the tax system, and so they wanted to go ahead with higher taxes, and that's what the Republican Party stood for. In fact, when they had their convention in 1860 in Chicago, when they brought up putting back the tariff high, they said that there was such a roar in the convention hall with canes and hats being thrown in the air. I guess you had to look where you were, and because they wanted to see the tariff come back. Because the belief was that the high tariff would protect the industries of the North and create the prosperity, and so of course the South would catch the brunt of it. But then the South would have to buy Northern goods because you wouldn't let them be able to buy European goods because of the cost would be too high. So tariff was a major issue, and generally throughout the South they felt it was very damaging to their economy, and they were probably right. But they felt that they violated the Constitution because the Constitution says taxes should be equal and uniform, essentially. And they weren't, because they got 90% of taxes came from the South. I've got it someplace down there. And but I felt that with the Civil War, it's just hard to believe that we had such terrible leadership. I mean, it's called the blundering generation. I don't know if you ever heard that word, but it's a good word to describe the Americans during that period, and blundering on both sides. And I thought that the greatest blunder of all was the bombardment of Fort Sumter. That was just a stupid thing. It started the war and made Lincoln look like a hero. They started the war, they blew up, fired on the flag and all that stuff. And it's interesting, the Secretary of State named Toombs in the Southern Cabinet, he said, we should not do that. He says, we'll lose every friend we got in the North. Well, when the order was going out to bombard Fort Sumter. And he says that they will descend on us like a horde of wasps or hornets, which they did, of course. But it seemed to me if the South had played its cards right, maybe just been resistant to it. They might have, they have a lot of sympathy around the world. Most people don't know that, but America at that particular time was looked on by many of the European powers as a very dangerous country because of the fact that we had stolen half of Mexico, under a phony pretense, and it looked like we were going to take over the world down here, so, which I think looked favorable to a lot of people. But that's something we'll talk a little bit about that. We don't have to follow the outline here too closely. The Southerners wanted their independence, and I think they had a yearning for independence from the North, and they've been maintaining a very delicate balance because they had enough votes in the Senate, to have a lot of weight. But in the meantime, population growth was in the North. And as the population grew and grew and grew in the North and didn't grow in the South, pretty obviously that the North had control of the House of Representatives and they could do damn everything they wanted to. What Lincoln mentioned in his inaugural address, he said, I understand the Congress has passed a new constitutional amendment. You see, the President doesn't sign the constitutional amendment. I recently read some recent journal where they said that President Buchanan had signed this constitutional amendment. No, the President doesn't do it. It's Congress that initiates by 2/3 vote the constitutional amending process and then sends it to the states for 3/4 vote. So Lincoln says, I understand the Congress has passed an amendment prohibiting the federal government from ever interfering in slavery. Now, what more could the South have wanted if it was a slave issue? They won the war. And Lincoln says, I have no opposition to this. So that he killed the slave issue. He even, like he says, I don't want to interfere with slavery. It's none of my damn business. And he also was on that group that wanted to pack up all the black folks and ship them off back to Africa. It was called the African Colonization Society or whatever the name was. And he was on favor of that. He just didn't think the whites and the blacks got along together, and they shouldn't get along together. And in the meantime, of course, all the other countries had abolished slavery. Britain had abolished slavery in 1830, and the French had abolished it, and the Dutch had abolished it, and the Russians had abolished serfdom with 30 million. So this was a great wave through the world to abolish slavery. Now, what about the British support of the South, of the Confederacy? They did have a substantial support in Britain. Well, how did they deal with the slave issue since they were so anti-slave, since they were the ones that really inaugurated the abolition? Their argument was very simple. They said, if the South secedes, that will be the end of slavery, because the rest of the world won't tolerate it, and they'll have enough clout to clamp down on the South and force them to abolish slavery. As it is, slavery is now protected by the Union. It's protected by the Constitution and the power of the North. But if they secede, then they'll lose that protection and they'll have to abolish slavery. And there was a lot of, where Robert E. Lee said all of the great men in the South wanted to get rid of the institution of slavery. And, he wrote that. And there was a strong movement within the South to get rid of it. But of course, when the war started, then the slave issue kind of came back. And if you read the ordinances of secession throughout the South, they do talk about slavery, and they do talk about slavery as being the reason that they're seceding. And John Calhoun said, well, we used that argument because nobody was too interested in the tax argument. So we thought that would kind of rouse public opinion, which of course it did. You tell us we have to do it. There's another little story that I want to tell you about my experience. And I've never told this. I've written a few letters to some of the leaders of Black America about it. And I'm a Canadian. And I've asked them about it. I said, when I was in the West Indies and I taught college the black students, they were the brightest, most interesting students I ever had in my life. I says, I just literally had almost a class of geniuses there, and they were all black. I says, how come when I was in the United States, and I was at UCLA, and I was in graduate school, how come I never ran into these kind? And none of them answered me. Maybe they're offended by it, but it's reality. It's the truth. The West Indian, well, even the Secretary of State is a black man with a Jamaican background. So I don't know why those kids were so damn smart, but I've written to some of the Soul and some of the famous black men, and nobody even dares answer me. But I think they should answer me. I think I deserve an answer. Yes.
I would just echo what you said in England about New England. The abolition groups that Garrison said they wanted to secede because they knew that if the South seceded, then they could eliminate the Fugitive Slave Act.
Right.
And so that would make slaves very easy to go across.
That's right.
Because they know they're not going to be sent.
Then you could get enough ship together, you could ship them all out of there. Yeah.
Another argument for secession from that standpoint, that it would have ended very quickly. But it was the Union that wanted to keep the South in.
Well, yeah, I think Sherman in his book that came out about a year ago, he talks about it, and he says South didn't secede over slavery. He says it was all over money. The wars are all over, and he said we should keep them where they are. We should keep the blacks or the Africans in the South, and don't let them out. And that is the reason. Another fascinating article I read, published in 1862 in Atlantic Monthly. Now that's a good old Yankee Boston magazine, and it was discussing why don't we want slavery in the territories? Not because of slavery, but because of the Africans. We don't want them in our society. And once we let them in the territories, we'll let them in everywhere. There's also a story in one British publication about some blacks up in New York. They were out on the street begging for money so they could go back to the South. Because up in the North, they're treated like lepers. And many of the writers, the British writers, they said they were hated more in the North. They really hated in the South, tolerated them and so forth, and they looked upon them as good workers and so forth. And one of the other things, just a little point we may run into because we're on this issue, is they say that Alexander, who was the vice president? Alexander Stephens. And he wrote, and he gave a great speech called the Cornerstone Speech. Do you ever remember that? And he said that, in fact, he said that slavery was the cornerstone of the South. And this is frequently cited to show that slavery was what the South stood for. Well, I went and read the Cornerstone Speech. That's a wonderful thing sometimes to go see what it really said. Because in his later life, after the war was over, he wrote a wonderful book called The Constitutional History of the Confederate States of America. It's a wonderful book. And in there he said that slavery was only a drop in the ocean compared to the reasons why we tried to secede. So then, that doesn't jive with the Cornerstone Speech. But if you read the Cornerstone Speech, that was in there. He's talking about the Africans being God's problem. That he created this inferior race, the blacks. And they're inferior. And it seemed that in Northern agreed that. Everybody believed that. And because they're inferior, we think the best system to deal with it is slavery. It gives them some dignity, it gives them a job, it makes them useful, but it is God's creation of this inferior race. And that was the cornerstone. The cornerstone was the inferiority of the Africans, not slavery. If you read it, it's pretty clear. But those things get twisted, and then people who got a cause, and a partisan cause, they will jump on it, and they'll say, what about the Cornerstone Speech? Well, that's what the Cornerstone Speech was about, the inferiority of the African race, and that this is the way God had created them. And we're stuck with them. The white man's burden that Kipling wrote about. So anyway, but this is the South, and you do have that interesting problem. Being in Canada, we have a lot of blacks. Most of our blacks are from the West Indies, Jamaicans, and that group. But it's and I do notice that we don't have any blacks here. That's rather interesting. Well, what about the Romans? There's the 1,000-year history of the Romans. I think it covers everything about taxes. I think that's the most interesting history I ever studied. We start off in the beginning when Rome was a republic and it was conquering. They had a citizens' war tax, and there's a relief from the showing the collection of the war tax. The war tax was a citizen war tax. You couldn't pay it unless you were a Roman citizen. If you were an alien or a non-Roman, you were denied the privilege of paying the citizens' war tax. So that's an interesting twist, isn't it, on taxation, that they would turn down money, which was easy taking, because if we went over then to Greece, during the days in which Greece was flourishing, one of their major taxes was the medicon, which is a tax on the medics, which was a tax on the foreigners. And it was a big problem, because if you were an Athenian, you didn't pay any tax. It was only these aliens that paid the tax. But since Greece was such a prosperous country and people really wanted to come there, then they would come and pay a tax. Well, then what do we have when a Greek marries an outsider? And we have these mixed children, mixed only in terms of origin. Well, there was a lot of fraud going on to prove that your mother and dad were both Athenians, because that way you got out of the tax system. And apparently it was really quite a lot of scandals going on. And the Greeks said an interesting thing. If somebody turned you in for cheating on your taxes, there was a penalty of 50%, and then they got half of it. So it was well, we still in theory have the same idea. We have the turning people in. I don't know how well that works. I had a client come to me whose CPA had turned him in, and I don't think he ever got a dime. Not just being you and me. This guy ended up in a slammer and so forth for a few years, but I don't think his CPA got anything out of it. I don't think he even paid any taxes out of it, because you can convict him for not paying taxes, but that doesn't give you the money. But we do have that idea of rewarding people for ratting on their friends and neighbors, and usually employees, and sometimes unhappy girlfriends and things like that. Well, so we have the citizen war tax. We also at the same time had the tax farmers. We had the auctioning of the harbor taxes. And that was interesting, because that seemed to work pretty good. And the auctioning was taken. It was done by the most famous people in society. It's interesting that in those societies, the tax system was under the administration of the great people. In other words, Ronald Reagan would have been a tax collector after office, and the same thing with maybe Jimmy Carter would still be out there collecting taxes. So that was part of their theory, because they thought it made a good impression from people. I had another chapter in one of my books called The Fall of the Colossus of Rhodes. Now, Rhodes was a great trading center on the Isle of Rhodes. It's off of Turkey, between Turkey and Greece. And it's a big island. And the Rhodians had a 2% tax. And they were very wealthy, and they kept the sea lanes free from pirates, and the tax was really quite successful in that sense. But then the Romans had a little trouble with Macedonia. That was the Greek area. And the Rhodians, instead of being loyal Romans, went to the two governments and said, hey, well, we'll act as mediators, we'll act as arbitrators. We'll help you settle your troubles. Well, the Romans didn't like that at all. They figured that those guys should be on our team, and they shouldn't be playing hanky-panky with the other side. So they then went ahead and defeated the Macedonians. And then, now what are you going to do with these Rhodians who have been disloyal to us? So the Romans, they didn't organize. They had a good navy. They didn't organize their navy or their armies. They destroyed the Rhodians by setting up on a nearby island a tax haven. And within a year, the revenues that were paid on the 2% tax, the Rhodes disappeared. And Rhodes literally disappeared as a commercial center. So it wasn't the Roman legions, it wasn't the Roman army, it was simply a 2% tax that destroyed the roads. And that's an amazing story, I thought. I think in the book I have the numbers as to how much was collected, and then within 1 year, why would you go pay 2% when you can go over the hill, to the next island and it's free? And so they were pretty smart guys in that sense. One of the great men of history is Caesar Augustus, because you might know from your biblical days that in the New Testament that Caesar decreed that all the world be taxed, and that everybody went to their homeland, so to speak. It was really to be registered for tax, and Mary and Joseph went off to Bethlehem because that was their location. And so usually in the old days, when you ever had a censors were basically tax planning. You want to find out how much people paid. So anyway, so Caesar Augustus became a very, very successful emperor. He turned the emperor from a war-prone Roman republic, and it's also sometimes called Pax Augustus, meaning the peace of Augustus. He brought peace to the world. He did. He really did. He brought peace to the world. He was a very, very successful ruler. When he came to Egypt, they welcomed him as he was. And yet Egypt was the most productive of taxes of any of the provinces, in the Roman Empire. But Egypt had become so corrupt with the Greek tax farmers and the corruption of society that they welcomed Augustus, and Augustus brought in the legions, and he put them to work cleaning up the dikes and cleaning up society so that they could be prosperous. And the Romans were smart on taxes. They only wanted to collect what you were already paying. So in Sicily, the grain taxes went to Rome rather than where they might otherwise have gone. The same thing was true with Egypt, places like that. He was a very astute taxman. I think I call him the master tax strategist. And that was his strategy, to make sure that the taxes flowed, and that's what the Romans were interested in. But of course he dies, and then when he dies, it's the usual story. The successors are not that decent, and so we have a couple of interesting tax revolts besides the three main revolts that the Jews set off that ultimately got them thrown out of the Holy Land and becoming a despised and dispersed people. We had a wonderful revolt up in Britain. And to you ladies, when a lot of people talk about taxes, I said, one of the most interesting characters was Princess Boudica. She was up in Britain, and she organized her people to throw out the Roman rulers. And she gave a speech, and it's in my book, recorded by the Romans, incidentally, in which she said, better for us to have been sold into slavery than every year to have to ransom ourselves from the Roman masters. Yes?
Didn't one of the cable channels made a movie of that?
They did?
I think in the last year.
I think I heard they were working on it. I don't know how well they
Warrior Princess?
Yeah. The only problem is she lost.
What was her name? What was her name?
Boudica.
Boudica.
Yeah,
That was it?
Boadica, Princess Boudica. Yeah, and I have a picture of her in my book.
A&E or TNT, one of those.
I see. Well, I had heard they were talking about it, but I guess they went ahead and did it. It'd be interesting to see how true to form it was. But the problem was that the Romans had such marvelous generals. And the general went up in there and he organized his forces and just slaughtered the English. Just slaughtered them by superior military tactics. And then after that was over, they had another revolt down in France. And again, and on both of these things, the Romans made a study of it, and they realized that what set off the revolt was corrupt tax collectors and taxmen, and that's the remedy. But they can't go around and tolerate this kind of stuff. And so the same general that crushed Boudica went up into France and crushed their rebellion. And he gave a wonderful speech. He said that And in effect, it wasn't a good idea to do this, because he says there will be better times and there will be better men that will replace the ones you have. And so you should let the fortune run its course, so to speak, because we can't tolerate this kind of stuff from you guys. So he put down that rebellion as well. So we had the three great rebellions. There was the Israeli, the Jewish rebellions, followed by Boudicca, and followed the rebellion in Gaul is where it was. And the Romans crushed it, and I don't think that anybody was too enthused after that about rebelling. The Romans also gave us serfdom, which what happened is that the tax rates were pretty high because of the later greed of the Romans, and so the small taxpayer would surrender himself to a big landowner, and he'd get immunity from taxes because he was now owned by the landowner, basically a serf. And then the big landowner had enough clout to control the tax system and control the Roman Senate, and very often he would lobby a new tax immunity law and amnesty through the Senate, and that's kind of how the system worked. This idea of serfdom shows up again in Russia. See, in the Middle Ages, Russia was about the only place in the Western area that was free. The Russian peasant could roam around and contract his services out to the nearest nobleman, and he had that freedom. Well, because we think of it, gee, what about serfdom in Russia? When we had abolished serfdom in the western part of Europe, Russia was locked into a terrible system of serfdom. There were millions and millions of serfs. But the way that came, Peter the Great was kind of he saw these people not working, and he decided that he was going to clamp down on them, and so he herded all the men that weren't working, and he said, you got three choices. He says, either you can pay taxes, or you can become a galley slave, or you can join up with one of the nobles and become a serf. So they took the easy way out, and he turned down one of the great safety valves for in Russia with the Cossacks. There was the Don Cossacks and the Dnieper Cossacks, and they were a freebooting bunch. They had their own leaders, and they didn't pay any taxes. And what usually happened when some peasant got too unhappy with his relationship with his lord, he'd just pack up his bags and head for the Cossacks, and he would join up with the Cossacks. And it was a good safety valve for the country as far as rebels and starting rebellions. But it turned out that he destroyed the safety valve. And then the peasant revolt started, and one of the most interesting ones was a fellow named Pugachev, who started he had 10,000 serfs with him heading for Moscow to complain to the Catherine the Tsar about the situation, and he was captured and executed, and at the end of him, that was the end of Pugachev. And she was so mad that she went to the town where he was born and had it destroyed, obliterated from the face of the earth. You didn't want any more of him around, or his kind, so to speak. But it wasn't until Alexander II came along in 1860, at the time that America still had slavery, and he abolished 13 million slaves in Russia with a stroke of a pen. He called in the nobles and he says, look, we're going to have a revolt. Our society's going to be destroyed. You're going to lose your great estates. We've got to abolish slavery. And he did, with a stroke of a pen. Now, the serf wasn't that wear off in Russia because what he did he put a price tag around their neck so that they had to pay off the landlord for the value that they were, but they got their homes, they stayed right where they were, and so in that sense, they were reasonably happy, and then once they paid off that debt, then they were free and clear. So sometimes when you look at what America abolished slavery, when we abolished slavery, we had the Emancipation Proclamation, which really didn't abolish slavery. It was basically a war measure. But then they came along with the 13th Amendment, which incidentally was the same number of amendment as the one that Lincoln saw that would never interfere with slavery. It was 13-2. In fact, a number of the states actually approved it. And you got to remember, it was passed by a Congress where there were no Southerners there. So the 2/3 vote for that amendment came from the North. They were very happy to keep their fingers out of it. And that's that side of that coin. And so what do? We passed a constitutional amendment which abolished slavery and did nothing to deal with the problem, really. We just said you're free, and you really were free to starve. That was the other side of it. So it wasn't very good emancipation. Like when the British abolished slavery in the West Indies, they compensated the slave owners, and in Jamaica, for example, 2 or 3 instances where they gave them huge parts of the land were divided up to the ex-slaves, so they would have their own little home and their own little plantations and all that thing. It takes a bit of intelligence to get rid of slavery in that sense. One British journal, one of the most interesting things I read in my research, and this came out in about 1861 or 2, and the author said the worst thing that Britain ever did in its history was to try and tax the American colonists and set up the American Revolution. That was a terrible thing on our part. Why? Because if we hadn't tried to tax them, the Americans would stayed in the British Empire. And in 1833, when we abolished slavery, we would abolish slavery in the colonies in America. So there wouldn't have been any slave issue to heckle about. Interesting, the British wrote that. Isn't that something? We 4th of July, we have all the celebrations, but according to him, that was not a good idea because it didn't deal with the slave problem, which would have been dealt with if they'd have stayed in the empire. The British, they compensated the owners, and they made various provisions to give these people jobs. And maybe that's why when I taught in the West Indies, these kids were so damn smart and didn't have any chip on their shoulder. They were proud of themselves and proud of their culture, proud of their island that they lived on. I didn't get any of that sense you get down here. They were set free, and they have a celebration. I think it'd be a week from Sunday or Monday. It's the first Monday in August, and it's throughout the former British West Indies, and it's called Emancipation Day. And it's quite a big celebration. That was roughly the day that Parliament emancipated the slaves. So when we talk about slavery, I remember when I was living in the West Indies, we Americans were getting together and celebrating 4th of July. And we had the barbecue and all the usual stuff everybody has and so forth. And one of my old British friends says, wasn't that Declaration of Independence kind of a farce? I said, what do you mean? He says, you had 3.5, 4 millions of black slaves. Hell, you didn't set them free. I says, there weren't that many at the time. They hadn't multiplied that much. But he says, you talk about all men are created equal. You ought to be kidding. Not with you guys. And he just really gave it to me, and I said to him, my mouth open. I'd never heard it before. I'd always thought the American Revolution was a glorious event, but anyway, after Augustus, and we had this terrible inflation of the money, where the Roman emperor started melting down the silver and adding copper and more copper until it became practically worthless. Then came a guy named Diocletian. And he was the last great powerful emperor, and he's a forced system. And Diocletian, he remade the money and the tax system, and he just ordered everybody to stay where they were because so many people were fleeing and going north. And one of the sayings you run into is where, let us flee to the land of the barbarians, where we may live as free men. And these are Romans, you see, and the land of the barbarians was up in Germany in that area, and then they would have their freedom. So Diocletian says, we got to stop this running away, and we're losing taxpayers, so everybody will stay where they are. Nobody can go anywhere. If you're a cobbler, then you're going to be a cobbler forever, and your children are going to be cobblers. Cobblers are shoemakers, incidentally. I remember that even when I was a young man, thinking of what I was going to do in high school, and this fellow, he was a father, a friend of mine. He says, "Well, why don't you just be a cobbler? Because people will always need shoes." So that a good way to remember the definition. So Diocletian just ordered everybody to stay where they were, and then they enslaved the Roman Empire. And one of the writers, says, let me see, I love this. Let me see if I can find it here. This is, let's see. I have an interesting chapter called Islam, Death or Taxes to the Infidel, which is worth because that was the system. Now it's just death to the infidel. We forget the tax side of it. Yeah, here's the thing. It's on page 118. The emperors of the 4th century, and above all Diocletian, grew up in an atmosphere of violence and compulsion. They took their duties seriously, and they were animated by the sincerest love of their country. Their aim was to save the Roman Empire, and they achieved it. They never asked whether it was worthwhile to save the Roman Empire in order to make a vast prison for scores of millions of men. So here we had the enslavement in the Roman Empire, and it was done to preserve the people from leaving. I like that saying, "Let us flee the land of the barbarians," or maybe we may live as free men. It tells you a lot about what was wrong with Rome and why Rome, went to hell. It was sad because the Romans went from 4 different systems of tax, which I have charts on it, and they ended up with this new order where they enslaved scores of millions of men. Let's see what we do. Now, I did talk a little bit about ancient China, and I wanted to. That's in the new book. It's in the second edition. It's not in the original edition. And the wisdom of the Chinese was this 10% tax, and Confucius proposed it, and Mencius, his follower, proposed it. Then the emperor came along who built the Great Wall of China. Well, he couldn't build a Great Wall on 10%, so he had a 50% tax. And this sent off essentially a revolution. But then came this guy who governed by doing nothing, and that's the literal translation of his name. And they reduced everything to 3%. There was one wonderful safety valve was in the early Chinese society, and it was called the mandate of heaven. And all rulers had to rule with the mandate of heaven. And if they violated the mandate of heaven, then they were subject to be overthrown, revolution, and get rid of them. And the mandate of heaven was a moderate 10% tax system. It seemed to be what the people were interested in. So we don't quite have that. I wish we did. We can have a revolution. We'll talk about Islam. Now that we have all these wonderful Arabs running around blowing everybody up, and Arab is a word I know, but one of my friends calls them Arabs. I kind of like it. Anyway, there's a map in here. It shows you the spread of Islam. It's on page 132. And it shows you in 100 or so years how the Muslim empire grew from Mecca, there in Saudi Arabia, then up into Persia, then over into India, then across Africa, all the way into Spain. That was only 100 or so years. That was probably the most successful proselyting the world has ever known. And they had a good system. Death or taxes to the infidel. And we read in one record where it said that the believers in the Messiah gave up their faith, meaning the Christians, of course, because the Christianity was strong through here. See, this is Roman. The Romans had adopted Christianity, and within a couple hundred years, there were no Christians around, because death or taxes for the infidel. If you joined Islam, you were tax-free. I mean, you talk about a deal. I mean, man, I could believe that myself. Yeah, that was the system, So they went death or taxes to the system, and there's even one instance in there where the Islamic up around in Palestine area, they were having trouble with some of the Romans, the older Romans, that came out of Constantinople was then. And they became Istanbul, and they had to abandon the city because they couldn't defeat or protect the Christians or the Jews from the incoming armies of the Romans, these later Romans, and they refunded all the taxes to the Christians and to the Jews because he says the tax is for your protection, and we can't protect you, so we'll give you your money back. That was an interesting. Nice guys, huh? There is also here the picture of a gold dinar, which was the famous tax that they paid, to Islam. They seem to have been fairly decent guys, and then they got corrupted by tax, and and we read that they were the cruelest of men. Collecting the taxes. When they ran out, their biggest problem was that Islam ran out of infidels. If infidels don't pay any taxes, then when everybody becomes a Muslim, then where are you going to get your money? So this was a serious problem for the spread of Islam. But by now they're all the way into Spain, they're all the way across, rule the whole damn world, and they're quite a powerful group. But with the loss of infidels, then they had to reintroduce the tax, and then of course they did. But I love this story. It's another, you talk about how taxes affected history. This is sure a wonderful example of the way it did, and that was literally the exact words: taxes or death to the infidel. And it really made a lot of believers out of everybody. I thought that they were pretty smart guys. They don't have that anymore. Wouldn't that be something? Here's a description in the end of this chapter about how bad they had become. They were cruel rascals, inventors of 1,000 injustices, arrogant and presumptuous. They were the scourge of their age, always with a causeless insult ready in their mouths. Their existence passed exclusively in oppressing the people of their time. They were a disgrace to humanity. And that is the Muslim rulers after they were corrupted by tax monies. Well, the next interesting chapter, which I like, is in the Middle Ages. And there's a picture on page 144 of William the Good of the Netherlands beheading a tax collector. And there's only one picture like this, and it's in the city hall in a small town in the Netherlands, and I was happy to get it. What happened is that during the Middle Ages, the taxpayers had a wonderful, wonderful weapon. They had God on their side. And when they made covenants with the kings and the rulers and the nobles about collecting taxes, it was done in the name of God. And so God was a third party. There was the people, there was the ruler, and there was God. And if the ruler violated this covenant, and they call it a covenant, then he was offending God. Because how do you get God's approval? I don't know, or disapproval. But anyway, that was one of the problems. And so we had this this solid defense against new taxes. And there's one story where a noble went out and he introduced the taxes, and it was called an exactia in auditum, in Latin meaning unheard of tax. And you couldn't have an unheard of tax. The taxes were already established by solid divine sanctions and agreements. And so we had, the taxpayer had God on their side. And there's some interesting stories that are in the book about this. I could think of a couple that fascinated me. Let's see if I wrote them down here. No, we got the expulsion of the Jews. We then have to move up in the Middle Ages to the British and Magna Carta era, and Magna Carta was a tax document. And I should mention about Magna Carta, there is no document called Magna Carta. There's the Constitution of the United States, there's Declaration of Independence. There is no Magna Carta as such. It has been handed down as the agreement that King John made with his nobles, that he wouldn't create taxes without consent of the realm, that merchants could travel freely throughout England, and as other kings came along, they reiterated it, but the original was long since lost from history, the original Magna Carta. So somebody says, I used to have trouble with my editors, because they would rephrase this. I says, no, you can't rephrase it because there is no document called Magna Carta. But it was an interesting document because it set the pattern for British rulers that they couldn't tax without the consent of the barons. And that became a real important issue. One of the kings, for example, wanted to recover some lands in Sicily, which the Pope had given him. And the barons turned it down. Another one wanted to recover some lands in Flanders, which apparently the king had title to. And they turned them down. They turned them down because they said, we're a Christian people. We do not engage in wars of aggression. We only engage in wars of defense and necessity and emergency. And Flanders and Sicily has got nothing to do with the defense of the realm. Now, they would raise some archers to recover Normandy, because Normandy was right across the channel, and that could become a staging place for an aggression against the country. So then they would go ahead and they would approve an aid, as they called it, to aid the king to recover the lands in Normandy for their protection. But this bargaining came between the nobles and then the king, and then the consent of the realm, and pretty soon the consent of the realm meant they had to consent to it, and consent meant that the baron himself had to consent to it. So one particular baron who wouldn't cough up the aid to the king was arrested, brought before the king's court. Why didn't you do it? And he says, well, I didn't vote for it. And the judge says, yeah, that's right, you didn't vote for it. So, didn't have your consent. So he got off the hook. And that would be great today, wouldn't it, if we all had to consent to the tax system? But anyway, that's one of the great, I think that's one of the great stories that come out of this period. But King John, for example, here's what one of the writers said: with occasions of his wars, he piloted them with taxes and tallages unto the bare bones, meaning his taxes, which, but they said the taxes had to be for defense only, or evident utility, evident necessity, and dire emergency. There was a rebellion let's see, where was this? In Cornwall, and the rebellion in Cornwall was because they tried to collect a tax, and for an invasion of Scotland, and they wanted to put the Scots down, and the Cornish people says, not on your doing, and so the Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas with three of his helpers went out to see what was going on, and they seized them both, and apparently the Chief Justice had the fastest carriage, because he's the only one that got out of there with his head. The rest of them had their heads chopped off, and they used to like to stick them on poles. And that was a great fad, stick the heads of tax collectors up on poles. So anyway, that wasn't so good. But see, the Scots The Scots had fought hard for their independence, and that's why I mentioned some time ago that most rebellions for independence did not succeed. The Irish certainly didn't succeed, and the Scots tried for 500 years to break away from the English, because it was England, that's right. But they were put down, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, he was supposed to be his savior, and of course. There's an interesting analogy to the Civil War, because when the British and the English were closing in on him, he dressed himself up like a woman and he escaped. Now, do you know your Confederate history about what the Yankees said about Jefferson Davis? That's what they said about him. They said Jefferson Davis was trying to escape as a woman in a woman's dress, and that's when they caught him. It was the same thing that actually happened to Bonnie Prince Charlie. The answer was that he had a shawl. I suppose that was his Confederate story. I don't mind him disguising himself as a goat. Maybe he can get away from the conquering enemy. That seemed to me not so bad. But when the war was over, one American firm in the North wanted to parade Jefferson Davis through the North dressed with a dress on and charge admission, sort of like, but of course they didn't do it to him. But he was tried. He was not tried, as you probably know, because they charged him with treason and indicted him. He was arrested. He was put in irons for a couple of years. They offered him a pardon. He said, "No way. If I'm a pardon, I have to admit I was wrong, and I wasn't wrong." He says, "Nope, I want my trial." And by that time, of course, Lincoln was dead, and they had Johnson was president. And they said, "What are we going to do with this guy? He wants a trial. If we try him, he's going to win, and we're going to lose in a court of law what we've spent hundreds of thousands of men on the battlefield." So it was a tough problem, and that they didn't want to turn him loose. Well, eventually they figured out, well, we just give amnesty to everybody in sight, and then that lets him go. So that's how Jefferson Davis. It would have been the trial of the century. It would really have been interesting, because some of the greatest lawyers in the North came forward and wanted to represent Jefferson Davis, and they felt sure they could win. And see, the bar at that time was pretty angry, because in the North, the policy of the Lincoln administration had been to arrest and throw away the key for thousands of people. Columbia Law Review says it was over 30,000 people locked up, and lawyers couldn't do anything. It's almost like the Guantanamo Bay problem. They couldn't do anything. And maybe some guy, like one guy said hooray for Jeff Davis, so they arrested him and threw him in prison. And so it didn't take much for you to get locked up. And so the argument, the bar was tired of going to the President Lincoln and to Secretary Stewart and begging to get innocent people released from these federal dungeons that they were in. So it was so they were happy to go to represent Jefferson Davis and hammer on those guys for the way they had mistreated so many people. It was too bad it wasn't tried. I think it would have been a great trial. I think it would be a terrific trial, because then they would have tried the real issue would have been the right to secede. That would have been the issue. Can you secede from the Union? Well, it took their consent to get in. Why couldn't you deconsent and get out? That was the argument. And of course that had always been true with treaties. It had always been true with various leagues, the European leagues that were during the Middle Ages. You could get out if you wanted to. So the trial never took place. It would have been a glorious trial, in my opinion. I would love to have been alive and to have defended the guy. Although, as I said some time ago, he was a damn fool to have bombarded Fort Sumter. He was just a damn fool to have done that. And I think that the South had played its cards intelligently, they would have seceded successfully. But I think they would have had to have not. See, this was an age of imperialism. It was an age of war. And there was so much zeal to go to war because the nations were building empire. Germany was building its empire. Britain had its empire. Why didn't America have its empire? So there was this great empire building itself. And there was a feeling that the South could win. And there was they had all the generals, they had not only the best generals, they had all of them, because all of the, good leaders in the army had been Southerners. So they were, but again, it was as preposterous to think they could defeat the North as it was for the North to think that they could destroy the Southern society, which they did. And I don't know if you read it, but the abolitionists in America were about the most bloodthirsty, vicious, despicable people that ever walked. And the British hated them with a passion. The British said, these are terrible people. What did they advocate? They advocated destroying the South, laying the South to ashes, burning all the cities, and killing all the men, women, and children, and repopulating it. And these are ministers. These are ministers that are in the abolition movement. And so one of the reviewers of my book that wrote in Amazon took issue to my statement that I said that the abolitionists in America were on the lunatic fringe. They were more than the fringe. They were dead solid in there. That's lightning or God speaking? Oh well. Well, yeah, the other thing that came out of this period in Britain, which I think is so important, was the concept of the separation of powers. Now we believe in that. We're taught, in school we have the separation of powers in our governments, federal and state. The power, the Congress is the power, and the executive is the power, and then the judiciary is the power. So in this period came along the idea of the separation of powers, but it was a little different. It was involved with taxes. It was that Parliament could tax but not spend, and the king could spend but not tax. And by separating these two powers, you obtained a pretty good balance. You obtained a pretty good control over government running wild. And I got somebody who wrote me and said, you should emphasize that more. And I think it was quite true, the separation of power. We saw a little of it in the Constitution, with the bills of revenue beginning in House and so forth. But it doesn't, and we do have some control that way, but we don't quite have the strong, solid rule that the Congress could tax but not spend, because then they have the appropriations side, so then they do spend. So we kind of lost sight of that. It would have been a really great thing. Well, one of my other favorite persons is another female, ladies, and that's Princess Olga. Now we got Boudica, who led the Great Rebellion against the Romans and was defeated. It said that 200,000 English were killed in that terrible thing. Well, up in Russia, they had a pretty crummy tax system. Is that there were these tax areas like Kiev, for example, which was a city, but also had all its outlying districts. And every winter, the ruler, the prince, would travel out in the cold and go from city to city to collect taxes. And it was a tough ordeal, and it was not a good time to be a tax collector. Well, Princess Olga, she comes along, and what had happened is they had murdered her husband, and she was a little bit unhappy with that. If you know the story, she invited these people that had killed her husband, and because her husband was trying to collect taxes, and so she said, "Oh, come on, this is great, and so they arrive with their boats, and she digs a great big hole, and they pick up the boat and they dump it in the hole, and then they dump dirt all over it, and they buried a whole bunch alive. So she was, she could be difficult at times if she didn't like it. Well, she was said in the Russian chronicles, they write of her that she was wiser than all men. That's an interesting comment. Or the wisest of women. And this is a day when women were looked upon as pretty nothing. She reorganized the tax system in just like we have today, the district director system. Rather than have the prince go out in the wintertime, all one slogging through the Russian winter and so forth, she would put one of her men there permanently, stationed in the town, and he's in charge of collecting the taxes. And so we don't have to go all through this complicated process. So I was the district director system, and it worked pretty well. Her son took over, and her son was named Vladimir. And if you go to Kiev and you go up on the hill, you'll see the picture of Vladimir standing there facing toward Moscow. And I've been there, and down below you'll see the Dnieper River rolling. And when I was there, I had the feeling, I know Hitler had been there, all the great enemies of Russia had come to this spot and had looked over. And it seemed this. The problem we had with this particular event was that the next thing that happened, after Russia finally got organized a little bit on what we call the Kiev waterway, there was Kiev, Novgorod, and Pskov with the three great trading cities along there, is that there came a guy by the name of Genghis Khan, and he and his warriors came roaring across the steppes in Asia. They went all the way up to the gates of Europe, and they just obliterated Russian society. Just obliterated. They said that with one Mongol warrior would stand on the horizon and the whole town would throw in the towel. And I guess it was Pushkin that said that the Mongols did not bring Aristotle to Russia. They're a pretty ugly bunch. They had a 10% tax, and this is a perfect example. Never judge a tax system by its rates alone, because the 10% was everybody and everything. So they take 10% of the men, 10% of the women, to 10% of everything they get their hands on. And so remember the rule. You don't judge a tax system by its rates alone, because they were a pretty rough bunch. The Russians were pretty well crushed under the Golden Horde, and the Golden Horde stopped short of Europe. And one recent Russian writer said that Russians' great service to humanity has been to protect the civilization of Europe. That they protected Europe from the Golden Horde, because by the time the Mongols had come through there, they just didn't have enough to go on into Europe and into the European region. So they stopped them. They stopped Napoleon. And if he had succeeded in capturing and taking over Russia, then he had been emperor. And they stopped Hitler. As much as we like to think that our armies and our invasion on D-Day was a big thing, Hitler was defeated by the Russians. 90% of the casualties of the German army were from the Eastern Front. So we're just a pittance, although I don't want to, cast anything against our invasion, because it was a wonderful, and we recently just celebrated it again, but it was the Russians who crushed and defeated the German army, the Wehrmacht. And so this writer said that the great service and sacrifice to the world has been done by the Russians, because we saved the Russians, and saved Europe from the Golden Horde. And I guess that's kind of true. One of the things that happened during this period is that there was quite a revolt against the Mongols, against the Horde, and they were pretty unhappy at that. And Alexander Nevsky, who was a ruler of Novgorod, he went to the Golden Horde and he says, let's make a deal. He said, don't treat us like you treat everybody else. And he said, we'll collect your taxes for you. And then you won't have to have wonderful, noble Mongol warriors collecting taxes. We'll do it for you. Well, so the Horde guy, Khan thought, okay, we'll let you do it. That'll be fine. And see, what they were doing is that not only when they took 10% of the population, they still shipped them down to the slave auctions in Baghdad, where the Mongols were. So, yeah, okay, we'll let you collect the taxes for us. Well, then comes along a ruler of a city that was never heard of before, Moscow. and this was a guy named Moneybags, Ivan I, Moneybags, and he would collect the taxes. And then the receiver of the taxes, he would show up from the Mongols, and he'd take the taxes and he'd take them back to the Khan and take them back to the various settlements of the Mongols. And this was a good deal, but Moneybags kept keeping a little. So he built up a pretty good pile of dough, so to speak, and eventually his successor was Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible turned around, and there's an interesting artist's depiction of when the Moscow Daroga, as he was called, came to collect the money for the Khan. Ivan the Terrible said, forget it. He basically turned him down cold, and it shows him fainting right on the spot when he was turned down. And then he turned around and he built the Kremlin. It was the only edifice capable of withstanding a Tartar siege, and he proceeded to drive the Mongols out of Russia. And he did it because of the tax system that foolishly was turned over to them. If the Khan had kept his own tax people, it may never happen. But the Russians were just good enough to con him into thinking that we collect him, and it was a good deal. For them, why should any noble warrior from the Muslim world, of course they had become Muslims pretty soon, degrade himself to collect taxes. So it's a wonderful story, and the Russian princes then slowly drove the Mongols out of Russia over to Astrakhan, over into what became Stalingrad on the Volga. They drove them out of there, and it was at this time, of course, that the Serfdom started, when Peter began to make sure that everybody had a job, and then they became serfs. Finally, I suppose we'll talk a little. No, that's supposed to be tomorrow. I'm supposed to be done today. Good. Let me. We got a few minutes. Anything you guys like to talk about? Yes.
Sister, I actually heard something recently that I've never heard before, and whether you could verify it. Again, about the Greeks.
Yeah.
That apparently before the democratization of Athens,
yeah,
there was this burst of economic prosperity and creativity, and what I heard was that this was sparked by a reduction in taxes. And
this was before the democratic Greeks?
Yeah.
That's interesting. No, the only thing I remember is that the tyrants, as they were called, of Athens, collected a direct tax. They collected a 10% tax on everybody, and that's how they built up their powerful city-states. And I didn't know that they had changed the rules, because it was getting rid of them. Well, like the word, here's an interesting thing on the back of this book. You see, this is thing in the Metropolitan called tyrannocides, because it was a virtuous act to murder a tyrant. And even when Lincoln was assassinated, Booth, made some kind of a comment about tyrants, and it's been a legitimate pursuit to murder tyrants. But I can't answer that. No. I'll have to look it up. Yes.
Under the Magna Carta, were the kings supposed to pay the ordinary expenses of the monarchy from their own lands rather than from the taxes collected? And the taxes was to be for war or emergencies or...
Well, there were quite a number of different types of taxes. There was a scutage, which was a shield tax that the knights paid. There was the aid to recover thing. And there was Peter Pence. You ever heard of that word? Peter Pence was the tax that went to Rome, and the British merchants, the English merchants, weren't very happy with that, and it was one of the things I think that made our friend Henry VIII popular, because there was a feeling that there wasn't a lot of precious metals in England, and they were being shipped off to Rome. It was called Peter Pence, and so when he cut that off, then the money in the coinage was going to stay in England. So that's about all I can tell you on that point. But I know there were a number of different taxes that people had to pay for various things, on the land of the nobles and things like that. But Magna Carta was essentially the consent of the realm. That was the key factor, because the kings of England had been collecting on their own. And that was one of the things that got Henry VIII in trouble, is that the normal dues, as Magna Carta uses that word, the customary dues, were not enough for him. And when he sailed to France, he had a ship with a gold sailcloth. Gold. And then he tried to introduce some taxes without the consent of Parliament. And they came down on him pretty hard, and he was penitent, and he said, I won't do it again, and so forth. I'll just steal the church. And that's clearly what he did, the great prize in breaking off from Rome, not only was that the Peter Pence was gone, that the money going to the Pope was gone, but now there was all these papal lands that belonged to the king. And so Henry VIII, really, that's why they used to call him Bluff King Hal, meaning Heister Hal was another name. He literally stole the Catholic Church in England. And he gave him a nice base for running things, and of course he was always out of money. And he was one of the worst kings they ever had. And he was the one who followed the Roman practice of adulterating the coinage. See, the shilling was really the coin of the realm, and he found out that if he could put in 20% or 30% base money, look at all the more money he created. Didn't have to tax anybody. God, this was a real deal. And of course, but the merchants weren't all that stupid. They realized that these shillings had been adulterated, and he was a terrible king. And then comes along his daughter, and I suppose I'll leave you. She was probably the greatest monarch the world has ever known. She was brilliant. She outsmarted all the rulers of Europe. She could speak many, many languages. And what had happened is, of course, Henry VIII didn't like her mother, because for various reasons he had her head cut off. But this was his daughter, and she was raised by Henry VIII's last wife, who recognized the brilliant little girl that was there. And so she was educated in foreign languages and in so many things. And she was just one smart cookie. She outsmarted not only the rulers of Europe, she outsmarted all the men in England. And she was the one that said to be loved and taxed is not given to man. You heard the saying? And she was referring to her reign that she wasn't going to tax. She wasn't offering that as an excuse for taxing. She was going to say, that's why I'm not going to tax. And she said, I would rather the money was in the pockets of my people than in my treasury. And I wrote an article about this, and it was published in the Washington Post, and they had a picture of her and everything and so forth. And I got the nastiest letters.
Is that in the second edition?
You mean the story?
What you just said?
No, this was in the Washington Post, the newspaper, and they had a whole page on it, and they had a picture of her and everything. And the title to it was, what good Queen Bess did not, why good Queen Bess did not say, read my royal lips. You remember that? You remember Bush reading I can read my royal lips. And my wife thinks that the reason is that a lot of men hate the fact that I praised her so much that she.
What were the nasty letters? What did they say?
Yeah, it was just nasty. It was just about her. One of them said that she spent all the money that she had and it wasn't very good. But what she did in spending the money, in order to melt down the coinage that had been adulterated by her father and create a pure silver shilling. She had to borrow an enormous amount of money from the city of Antwerp. But she restored the coinage. And that sent Britain on the road to superpowerism, the great commercial power of the world, because their money was good. And that was the point. But she really wasn't broke, despite the fact. I went and researched this after I got all these nasty letters, and I found out that she had enormous money owed to her from the Dutch. She had money owed to her from the King of France. She had some Parliament had granted her taxes that she never had collected because she didn't want to. So she wasn't broke. She had a lot of money coming in if she'd have just pursued it. But the coinage problem is what gave birth to Gresham's law. You heard that term before? Thomas Gresham was her financial advisor. And he said that bad money drives out good. And that became Gresham's law, but it was Elizabeth's doing, so to speak, and at least she believed in him, and then she proceeded to restore the coinage. Some of the saying was that she restored the money. And another thing she did, she eliminated an oath for taxes. In other words, you guys signed your tax return under penalty of perjury and all those goodies. Well, she took that away. She did not want people in England have to swear an oath on taxes. She'd take their word for it. And a remarkable position that she took. Actually, the U.S. Supreme Court in a case in 1890 or something, Boyd case, brought that up, that it was wrong to make people take an oath to pay taxes. That was the Supreme Court of the United States. So it lived on for quite a while. It also lived on after her. During the time of the American Revolution, there were some articles, again, pointing out Elizabeth's position. And her reason was, there is a tradition of evasion in the realm. So I don't want people to have to swear, because the people were old serious in those days. You know, it was God strike me dead type stuff. You know, so that was her. But anyway, you can tell she's my favorite monarch. But in the new book, there's a whole chapter on her, because I did some more research, and Irish, of course, weren't very happy with her either. You know, she put down the Irish Rebellion, so there were. In fact, I spoke one of the things I would wish I could find. I spoke at Princeton, and I spoke with Margaret Thatcher. And she and I had a big argument over her taxes. And somebody took this on film. So here we are arguing away about her taxes. And later on I got a copy of it, and I have some place around. And I said, you know, in my book, I talked to her, I said, you know, the Financial Times said if you had read my book, you'd still be Prime Minister. Oh, Jesus. She came out of her shoes. And, you know, she has a voice that was shattered glass. I don't know, you know, speaking in Parliament, you know, they had a real powerful voice, you know. God, she was powerful. And so she says, I said, yeah, I said, what I wrote about is that the British people had rebelled against poll taxes since the Middle Ages. They had never accepted a poll tax. And I said, you tried to introduce a poll tax and it cost you your job. She said, it was not poll tax. She says, it was a community tax. For a bright person, you know, there's no such thing as a community tax that has a generic meaning. It's just a name that she put on a poll tax. But that was one of my great experiences, in particular when I saw these pictures, and here we are going to each other. But she was remarkable. I praised her because she got rid of exchange controls, and that was a great service to the British economy, the British people. Exchange controls means that you can't convert into a foreign currency without permission from the government, for which there is no appeal. So if you want to buy Dutch cheese, and you want to spend British pounds, you have to convert to guilders, and you have to then go to the British government to get permission. Well, they would do it on cheese. Of course, they do it on that. But that's what exchange controls are about. Now, they're a terrible thing. When I was living in the Cayman Islands, we had what I called the Jamaica shuttle, because Mac O'Malley, who was a bit of a communist and also was a socialist, and he introduced some harsh exchange controls on Jamaican currency. And so small Cessna airplanes were landing on roads in Jamaica and picking up bundles of Jamaica currency and flying to the Cayman Islands and dumping it off and putting it in the banks there, because the banks there were Canadian banks, with all the Canadian banks over there. And so the Canadian banks ran out of money. So they got on the phone to Cayman Islands and says, would you please send us some of that money back? We don't have any money to service our customers. And so the money came back, but that was simply to beat exchange controls. And to give you an example of what the Jamaicans have done to their money, when I got to the Cayman Islands, they didn't have their own money. They used the Jamaican dollar. And the Jamaican dollar was half a pound, and it was $1.20 US. So it took $1.20 US to buy one Jamaican dollar. You know how much it cost today? About a penny? Less than 2 cents? So a Jamaican dollar is worth less than 2 cents today. And it was once worth $1.25. It just shows you how bad governments can mismanage their money. I'm glad I didn't have my money in it, but that was the world that Michael Manley and all that bunch created. Well, the Russians did the same thing. They printed. When I went to Russia back in 1970, my wife's a Russian, so I took her back to meet family and stuff. And we went in the Hermitage, and you bought a coupon, and the coupon was a ruble. And the ruble at that thing was $1.20 US. I went there in 1994. They had the same coupons. They were surcharged 7,000 rubles. So it's easy just to print the stuff, but this is what happens. Well, it's time to go, and I'll see you tomorrow. And we'll pick up from where we left off. So we will until tomorrow. Oh, I want to talk about the Swiss. Yeah.